The alcove smelled of hothouse orchids and something older, the faint mineral tang of memory crystals embedded in the walls, recording everything, forgetting nothing. Alina catalogued this the way she catalogued all things. Potential threat, potential asset, filed and dismissed. She stood 3 paces from the doorway, close enough to the exit that her instincts approved, yet far enough inside the silk-draped chamber that etiquette was satisfied. The inner circle did not suit her. It never had. Its corridors were too wide, its ceilings were too vaulted. Everything was designed to make a person feel observed, and yet diminished in equal measure. The private alcove Lord Edric had chosen for their meeting was no exception. It was an intimate pocket of extravagance that was tucked behind a gallery of echo fountains whose gentle murmur provided ambient cover for conversations that were best left unrecorded. Ironic, given the crystals threaded through the plaster. She suspected Edric kept his own copies of everything. He was already seated when she arrived, positioned in a high-backed chair that framed his shoulders like a throne. The crystal goblet in his hand caught the warm light of the sconces, and threw fractured patterns across the damask tablecloth. Deep red wine, the color of old blood, was barely touched. His fingers tapped against the goblet's stem in a rhythm she recognized as deliberate. Everything about Lord Edric Hale was deliberate. "You're punctual," he said, as though punctuality were a charming eccentricity rather than a professional requirement. "You specified the hour." His smile was the practiced kind. It was warm enough for the public galleries, yet thin enough for her to see the calculation behind it. She had worked for him 4 times over the past 3 years, and she had never once seen the expression reach his gray eyes. They were the same shade as her own, she'd noticed during their first meeting. The resemblance ended there, though. Where her eyes moved constantly, assessing, his remained fixed. Like a predator comfortable enough in his territory to hold still. The scar along his jawline caught a sliver of light as he tilted his head. She carried a matching mark on her own jaw, though hers was silver and thin as thread. His was newer, pinker, worn like a badge rather than a lesson. "Sit," he offered, gesturing to the chair across from him. She did not sit. "The contract." The practiced warmth left his face like oil sliding from glass. What remained was the private Edric, clipped, precise, and stripped of any performance. She preferred this version. It was more honest, which made it more predictable. "Corin Vale." He spoke the name the way one might identify an insect found in an otherwise clean room. "You've heard of him. The voice of the forgotten." She let the alias sit between them, as neutral as a blade that was still sheathed. "Dramatic, isn't it? They do love their theatrics in the lower districts." His fingers resumed their tapping. "He's been gaining influence for the better part of a year now. Speeches in the forgotten depths, quiet meetings in the whisper woods, sympathizers cropping up as high as the Vale Quarter. We've tolerated it as the usual grumbling, but—" He paused, lifted the goblet, and considered the wine without drinking. "He's organizing, not just inspiring. There's a difference, and we've reached the point where we must acknowledge it." Alina said nothing. She had learned long ago that silence drew more information than questions. The royal voice has determined that Corin Vale represents an unacceptable risk to the kingdom's stability. The shift to formal language was seamless, Edric wrapping the crown's authority around himself like a cloak. "We require his removal, discreetly. Timeline: before the autumn equinox, before the next tithe." He set the goblet down with a soft, precise click. "There are concerns that he may attempt to disrupt the sovereign's communion. We cannot allow the ceremony to become a stage for his particular brand of martyrdom." She filed the timeline. 2 months. Generous by her standards, which meant the target was well protected or the intelligence was thin. She suspected both. "His movements," she said, "irregular, which is part of the difficulty. He alternates between the forgotten depths and the luminous district, bold enough to speak publicly, clever enough to vanish afterward. He has a strategist, a former merchant's son, methodical type. Keeps the logistics running." Edric's lip curled faintly. "And a healer in the Vale Quarter who tends to their injuries when enthusiasm outpaces discretion." Personal security. Minimal and inconsistent. He relies on crowds rather than guards. The man believes his own mythology, that the people will shield him. A note of genuine contempt now, thin and sharp as a paper cut. He moves through marketplaces, attends festivals, speaks in open squares. He makes himself accessible. It's either courage or stupidity, and we needn't determine which. Alina's mind was already constructing the architecture of approach. A target who sought crowds was a target who could be reached through proximity. Her particular skill set made proximity deadly in ways a blade could not match. "You want extraction before elimination," she said. It was not a question. Edric met her gaze. The tapping stopped. "We want to know who supports him. Names, locations, supply lines. The rebellion is a weed, and we intend to pull it up by the roots." He leaned forward, and for a moment the sconces threw his features into sharp relief, the distinguished silver at his temples, the careful architecture of his composure. "Your abilities make you uniquely suited for this. Extract what you can, then end it cleanly." She absorbed this, without expression. The contract was straightforward: intelligence gathering followed by assassination, dressed in the Crown's usual euphemisms. She had performed variations of this work a dozen times already. The target's public profile made the initial approach simple. The extraction would require sustained contact, multiple touches, a careful dismantling of his mind's defenses before the final severance. "Compensation," she said. He named a figure that confirmed what she already suspected. They were afraid, not of one man, but of what one man might become if left unattended. Fear made employers generous, which made them dangerous in different ways. Generous employers expected perfection. Acceptable. She committed the number to memory alongside everything else. The timeline, the target's habits, the strategist, the healer, the gaps in Edric's intelligence that she would need to fill herself. She turned to leave. "Alina." His voice caught her at the threshold, and she registered the use of her first name, a calculated intimacy, a reminder that he knew her as something other than a tool. "The Crown places great trust in your discretion. This contract does not exist. Corin Vale will simply cease to be relevant." She looked back at him. The practiced smile had returned, warm and hollow as the echo fountains murmuring beyond the alcove walls. "They always do," she said. She descended from the inner circle as the mind spire pulsed overhead, its crystalline surface shifting through hues of deep violet and restless amber. The collective mood of the city rendered in light, though she had never trusted its readings. The palace corridors gave way to broader avenues, the air thinning of orchids and filling instead with the commonplace smells of cooked food and street dust. Her gloved hands hung at her sides, fingers loose, already cataloging what she would need. 3 disguises, a rotation of observation posts, a schedule mapped against the district's festival calendar. Corin Vale. She turned the name over in her mind like a coin, examining both faces, the voice of the forgotten, a man who believed crowds could protect him. She would show him otherwise. The first disguise was the simplest, a merchant's assistant in a dun-colored apron, her unremarkable hair pinned beneath a linen cap, her posture softened into the slouch of someone accustomed to standing behind a stall for hours. Alina had purchased the apron from a second-hand vendor in the Vale Quarter and worn it for 2 days before the assignment began, letting it absorb the smell of her rented room, of the forgetting facades, of a life too dull to warrant scrutiny. She arrived at the luminous district's eastern market before dawn on the first day, positioning herself behind a display of imported spices whose pungent warmth would mask any trace of the reagents she carried in the hidden pockets of her vest. She waited 3 hours before he appeared. Corin Vale moved through the market like a current through still water. Not fast, not forceful, but impossible to ignore once he was noticed. He was taller than the intelligence had suggested, lean in a way that spoke of missed meals turned into muscle memory, his chestnut hair falling across his forehead in an artful disarray. She catalogued details with the practiced efficiency of years. The slight favoring of his left leg when navigating crowds, the scarred knuckles of his right hand, the amber-tinged eyes that swept the square with an alertness that he disguised as just casual interest. A man accustomed to looking over his shoulder while pretending to admire the architecture. He was accompanied by a compact figure she identified from Edric's briefing, the strategist, dark-eyed and vigilant, positioned half a step behind and to the left where he could observe both Corin and the crowd simultaneously. A professional arrangement, though executed with the looseness of long familiarity rather than formal training. Alina purchased a pouch of saffron she didn't need and watched as Corin stopped to speak with a fruit vendor, his entire body angling toward the woman with an attentiveness that bordered on intimate. The vendor laughed at something he said, touching her own cheek as though surprised by her own delight. He moved on. The woman stared after him. Charisma, Alina noted. The genuine variety, not Edric's calculated warmth, but something that seemed to radiate from him without conscious effort. She filed this under complications and continued watching. By the second day, she had traded the merchant's apron for the draped silk of a minor noble's attendant, her walk altered to the measured glide that was appropriate to the luminous district's upper echelons. The memory glass windows along the main promenade reflected fragments of past celebrations back at her. Ghostly dancers spinning through ballrooms, lovers kissing beneath archways that had since been rebuilt, a child's face bright with wonder at fireworks that had burned out decades ago. The district was saturated with curated beauty, every surface designed to remind its inhabitants of prosperity and contentment. It made her skin itch. She positioned herself beneath a colonnade of pale stone where the shadows pooled deep enough to observe the small gathering that had formed near an echo fountain. Corin stood at its center. He was not elevated or behind a podium, but he was among the listeners, as though the distinction between speaker and audience was one he found unnecessary. "The tithe takes more than memories," he was saying, his voice carrying that resonant quality that made words feel less heard than physically received. "It takes the self that existed in those moments. Every joy surrendered is a piece of identity the crown consumes, and they call it harmony." The crowd, perhaps 30 people, an unremarkable number that wouldn't trigger royal attention, leaned toward him. Not uniformly, not with the orchestrated devotion of the inner circle's propaganda displays, but with the unconscious gravity of people hearing something that they had always suspected, but they never dared to articulate. A woman near the front pressed her hand to the space behind her ear, where the silver marks of the last tithe would still be fading. Alina watched Corin's hands as he spoke. They were expressive, cutting the air with gestures that gave his words physical architecture. Yet the scars across his knuckles told of a different story. A man who had learned to fight before he learned to orate. His amber eyes moved across faces with genuine attention, pausing on individuals, making each person feel momentarily singular. It was, she recognized, the same technique she used when assuming a cover identity, the gift of focused presence. But where she deployed it as a tool, he seemed to wield it as an extension of some fundamental belief that every person mattered. She catalogued this too, though the category it belonged to was less clear. The third day brought rain, a thin, persistent drizzle that turned the luminous district's polished streets into mirrors. Alina wore her own face this time. Her dark hair was hidden beneath a hooded cloak as she moved through the thinned crowds with the purpose of someone running errands in bad weather. She tracked Corin to a tea house near the district's western boundary, where the architecture began its descent toward the Vale Quarter and the buildings lost their memory glass ornamentation. He sat alone by a window, something she hadn't anticipated. The strategist was absent. There were no guards, no companions, and no audience to perform for. Corin sat cradling a ceramic cup between his scarred hands as he stared at the rain-streaked glass, with an expression she could only describe as tired. Not the physical exhaustion of a man who worked too hard, but the deeper weariness of someone carrying a weight he had chosen and could not set down. She watched from a table near the back, her own tea untouched, and felt something shift in her assessment, a recalibration so slight she almost missed it. She had expected arrogance. The intelligence had described a zealot, a man intoxicated by his own rhetoric. But the figure by the window was quieter than that, more complicated. And the vulnerability of him sitting alone in a tea house in a district where any number of people might recognize and report him spoke to either extraordinary recklessness or a loneliness so acute it overrode any self-preservation. She noted both possibilities without preference. That evening, in the narrow rented room she'd taken above a chandler's shop, Alina spread her observations across the desk like surgical instruments. his schedule's irregularities, the gaps in his security, the moments when proximity was possible. The Midsummer Festival was 6 days away. The luminous district would flood with revelers from every quarter. Physical contact would be normalized by the press of bodies and the license of celebration, and Corin, who could not resist a crowd any more than a flame could resist air, would be there. She mapped the festival grounds from memory, marking the sightlines and the escape routes, planning the approach angle and which disguise, the precise mechanism of the brush past that would allow her to extract without detection. Her hands were steady as she worked, her breathing even, her mind a clean, ordered instrument. But later, as she lay on the narrow bed and stared at the ceiling where the forgetting facade had worn thin enough to leak faint whispers of someone else's discarded dream, the image that surfaced was not her carefully plotted route through the festival square. It was Corin Vale sitting alone in a tea house, rain tracing lines down the window, his scarred hands wrapped around a cup as though it were the only warm thing left in the world. She turned onto her side and closed her eyes. Irrelevant, she told herself, and almost believed it. The Midsummer Festival draped the luminous district in silk and flame. Lanterns of blown glass hung from every archway, amber, violet, deep arterial red, casting the streets in shifting pools of color that bled into one another like watercolors left in the rain. The memory glass windows had come alive with the occasion, reflecting not just the present celebration, but the ghosts of festivals past. Translucent dancers from decades ago, whirling alongside the living, phantom musicians playing instruments that had long since crumbled to dust. The effect was dizzying. The boundary between now and then was smeared as thin as smoke. Alina moved through the crowd in a midnight blue dress she had purchased from a seamstress in the forgotten depths. Good fabric, simple cut, the kind of garment that suggested comfortable anonymity rather than wealth or poverty. She had arranged her dark hair differently, swept to one side and pinned with a silver clasp that caught the lantern light, and she'd softened the angles of her face with a subtle application of cosmetic powder that blurred the severity the mirror usually returned. Her walk was different tonight, looser, slightly swaying, the cadence of a woman enjoying herself rather than the precise economy of movement that was her natural gait. She was no one. She was anyone. The festival made it easy. The press of bodies around her was dense and fragrant, sweat and rose oil, spiced wine, and the acrid sweetness of festival smoke drifting from vendors' braziers. Musicians played on elevated platforms, their strings and drums weaving a rhythm the crowd absorbed through its feet. Children darted between legs, trailing ribbons of light that left after-images against the dark. Somewhere ahead, a woman laughed with the full-throated abandon of someone who had started drinking hours ago. Alina tracked Corin Vale through the chaos with the patience of a predator who has already chosen the moment of the kill. He had come alone. No strategist at his shoulder, no deliberate entourage. Just a man in a simple linen shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, moving through the festival crowd with the ease of someone who drew energy from proximity to others. She watched him accept a skewer of grilled meat from a vendor without paying, the vendor waving off his coins with a grin and a clap on the shoulder. She watched him crouch to speak with a child who had lost sight of her parents, his hand gentle on the girl's shoulder as he pointed toward a family searching nearby. She watched him tilt his head back and laugh at something a stranger said, his amber eyes catching the lantern light so that they seemed, for a moment, almost golden. He was unguarded. Not careless. She could see the awareness in the way his gaze swept the crowd even while smiling, but open in a way that defied tactical logic. He offered himself to these people like an unsheathed blade that offers its edge, deliberately, knowing it could cut both ways. She closed the distance in increments, adjusting her trajectory through the crowd with small, considered corrections. 30 feet. 20. 15. The festival square opened ahead, and the first of the fireworks announced itself with a hollow thump from somewhere beyond the rooftops, followed by a bloom of green and gold that shattered across the sky. Every face turned upward. Alina did not look up. She angled her path to intersect with his, timing her approach to the crowd's surge toward the open square. bodies pressed together as people jostled for vantage points, and in the crush, the brush of one shoulder against another was less than nothing. An unremarkable accident in a sea of unremarkable accidents. Her bare shoulder grazed his forearm. Skin against skin, 2 seconds of contact, no more. The world split open. It hit her like a wave breaking against a cliff face, not the controlled trickle of a standard extraction, but a flood. It was raw and unfiltered and carried a force she had never encountered in all her years of practice. His memories surged through the point of contact with a visceral intensity that buckled something behind her sternum. She saw the forgotten depths, not the map she had studied, but the real place, felt through his eyes, his lungs, his furious and aching heart. A crowd pressed into a low-ceilinged chamber where the walls wept ghostly light, and Corin stood before them with nothing but his voice and the terrible certainty that this could not stand. His words poured through her like a second pulse. They take your memories because they fear what you remember. They fear the proof that you were whole before they hollowed you out. The crowd surged with something beyond hope, something jagged and dangerous and alive. And she felt his exhilaration mingled with the nauseating terror that he was leading them somewhere he could not guarantee was safe. The memory fractured. Another replaced it. A mirror, his reflection staring back from a cracked glass in a dim room. Alone, the crowd's roar reduced to silence, and the silence worse than any enemy. His hands gripping the basin's edge, his amber eyes hollow with a doubt so profound it had its own gravity. What if I'm wrong? What if all of this... The thought didn't finish. He splashed water on his face, and the doubt went underground, buried alive, still breathing. Another fracture, another memory, and this one came edged in barbed wire. A family in a public square. The autumn equinox. Royal emissaries with their specialized vessels, the orderly line of citizens waiting for the tithe. A woman, dark-haired, young, holding an infant against her chest, reaching the front of the line and shaking her head. No, not this one. Please, not this one. The emissary's hand, steady and indifferent, pressing against her temple. The woman's face going slack. The infant beginning to wail in arms that had forgotten, for one terrible instant, how to hold it. And Corin, young, younger, his face still unweathered, standing in the crowd with his fists clenched at his sides and a rage building behind his ribs that would never fully leave, that would calcify into purpose and drive him to stand in underground rooms years later and say, "This could not stand." The contact broke. Alina was already 3 steps past him, carried by the crowd's momentum, but her legs had gone unreliable beneath her. Her breath snagged in her chest like fabric caught on a nail. Her pulse hammered, but not with the controlled elevation of exertion, but with something wilder, a rhythmic, a drummer who had lost the beat. She reached a stone pillar at the square's edge and pressed her back against it, one hand flat on the cool surface, while fireworks burst overhead in cascading spirals of white and crimson. The light played across her face, in patterns she didn't register. Her fingertips burned with a residual warmth that should have dissipated the moment she broke contact. It hadn't. She pressed her fingers together, testing. The warmth persisted, a low hum, almost electric, as though the stolen memories were still arriving in fragments too small to perceive but too insistent to ignore. In 10 years of extraction work, she had never experienced anything like this. Memories were inert once taken, data points to be stored and analyzed. They did not pulse. They did not leave an aftertaste of someone else's conviction coating the back of her throat like strong liquor. She steadied her breathing, counted to 10, counted again. In the square behind her, the fireworks reached their crescendo, and the crowd roared with a single voice that reminded her, horribly, of the underground chamber in his memory, that sound of people choosing to believe in something larger than themselves. Alina pushed off the pillar and disappeared into the festival's bright, thoughtless dark. The forgetting facade swallowed the festival's residual noise the moment Alina closed the door behind her. Music, laughter, the distant percussion of fireworks, all of it absorbed by the treated walls, until the only sound remaining was her own uneven breathing. She stood in the doorway for 3 seconds longer than habit required, letting the silence settle against her skin like cold water. The room offered nothing that wasn't necessary. Weapons arranged on the far wall with geometric precision. 2 blades, a garrote of spider silk wire, a set of extraction needles she hadn't needed tonight, a single chair positioned to face the door, its back to the corner where two walls met, a narrow bed, tightly made, a desk with a shuttered lantern and the locked wooden case that held her tools. No mirrors, no keepsakes, no evidence that anyone with preferences or memories of her own had ever occupied this space. She removed the silver clasp from her hair first, then the cosmetic powder with a damp cloth, stripping the festival persona away, layer by deliberate layer, until the woman in the midnight blue dress was gone and only Alina remained, sharp-jawed, scar-traced, gray-eyed. She peeled off the dress and hung it over the chair's back, pulling on the dark fitted clothing she wore when alone, comfortable as a second skin. Last, she removed her gloves. Her fingertips glowed. The crystalline residue was faint but unmistakable, a luminescence that clung to the pads of her fingers like phosphorescence lifted from a night sea. She had seen this before, after every extraction, the physical trace of stolen memories awaiting transfer. But this residue was different, brighter, warmer. It pulsed with a slow, steady rhythm that reminded her uncomfortably of a heartbeat. She lit the lantern and unlocked the wooden case, retrieving the specialized container, a palm-sized crystal sphere, hollow at its center, carved with channels designed to receive and stabilize memory fragments. She had carried this particular vessel for 6 years and filled it more times than she cared to count. The process was routine, clinical, safe. She pressed her fingertips to the sphere's surface and began the transfer. The memories flowed from skin to crystal in a cool stream, and as they passed through her she experienced them again, not with the overwhelming force of the initial extraction, but with the muted clarity of a second reading. She catalogued the intelligence value with professional efficiency. The underground meeting chamber in the forgotten depths. Low ceiling, stone walls saturated with ambient memory emissions, accessible through a drainage channel near the market district's southern edge. The crowd, approximately 40 individuals, mixed ages, several bearing the calloused hands of laborers. The emotional topology of the gathering, desperation tempered by nascent hope, fear subordinated to anger. Useful. All of it useful, the kind of raw intelligence Lord Edric would consume with the same precise satisfaction he brought to his wine. But the cataloging kept fracturing, splitting open along fault lines she couldn't control. Corin's voice in the underground chamber, stripped of the rhetorical architecture she'd observed in the luminous district, reduced to something rawer. They fear what you remember. She felt the truth of it in his chest, the way conviction sat against his ribs like a physical weight, the way he meant every word with a totality that left no room for performance. She had spent her career surrounded by people who spoke for effect, Lord Edric, the royal functionaries, her handlers at the Mnemonic Academy. She recognized the difference the way one recognizes real heat after years of standing near painted fires. She pressed harder against the crystal, forcing the transfer to continue. The mirror, his reflection, the doubt. She experienced it again and found herself lingering, not to extract intelligence, but because the vulnerability of the moment caught in her throat like a bone. This was the part of the target she was trained to exploit, the private weakness that could be leveraged, the fracture point where pressure would cause the whole structure to collapse. She should have been mapping it clinically, calculating how to widen the crack. Instead, she was sitting in his exhaustion, feeling the weight of his hands on the basin's edge, breathing with his lungs. She pulled her fingers from the crystal. The sphere glowed softly on the desk, its interior swirling with captured light, violet and amber, the colors of his memories rendered in miniature. She stared at it, pressed her thumbnail into the edge of her palm, grounding herself in the small, sharp pain. Catalog, transfer, file, move on. She reached for the sphere again. This time a different fragment surfaced, smaller, incidental, something that must have transferred in the initial flood without her conscious awareness. A detail, not a scene, the sensation of early morning light falling through a window onto wooden floorboards, the smell of brewing tea, the particular quality of silence that exists in a room where someone has just been sleeping. A private, unremarkable moment from Corin Vale's life that held no intelligence value whatsoever. She held it longer than she should have. The warmth of it spread through her fingertips, up her wrist, settling in the crook of her elbow like a borrowed tenderness. She recognized what she was doing, had recognized it for years, in the rare moments of honesty she permitted herself. The taking of more than was needed. The lingering in someone else's life because it was easier than inhabiting her own empty room, her own empty walls, the surgical absence she had curated so carefully that it no longer felt like absence, but like identity. She sealed the crystal and locked it in the case. It should have been over. The transfer was complete, the residue cleared from her fingertips, the intelligence secured for later analysis. She had performed this sequence dozens of times and knew its rhythms the way she knew her own heartbeat. The brief intensity of extraction, the methodical transfer, the clean silence afterward. A professional process with a professional conclusion. The silence did not come. Something remained. Not in the crystal, not on her skin, but deeper. A low, persistent warmth behind her sternum that resisted every attempt at dismissal. She pressed her hand flat against her chest and felt her own pulse beneath it, steady and unremarkable, but threaded through with something that did not belong to her. A faint awareness, gossamer thin, of another heartbeat somewhere in the city. Not heard, not imagined. Sensed, in the way one senses a change in weather before the sky confirms it. She sat very still in the single chair, her back to the corner, and waited for the sensation to fade. It did not fade. She ran through the possible explanations with mechanical discipline. Fatigue. She had slept poorly for 3 nights during the surveillance period. Stress. The festival crowd had required sustained vigilance, an unusually intense extraction, which could tax the practitioner's nervous system and produce sympathetic echoes. All of these were documented, all of them transient, all of them resolvable with rest and distance. She chose fatigue. It was the simplest answer, and simplicity in her experience was usually correct. She extinguished the lantern and lay on the narrow bed, still dressed, her boots within arm's reach, the locked case on the desk, a dark shape in the darkness. The forgetting facade hummed its low, mindless lullaby, absorbing the room's ambient traces, keeping her invisible. Behind her sternum, the warmth pulsed on. Steady. Patient. A thread of connection running from her chest out through the walls and across the sleeping city to a man she had been hired to kill. A man whose memories now lived inside a crystal sphere in a locked case, and whose heartbeat she could feel, impossibly, as though it had taken up residence alongside her own. Alina closed her eyes and told herself it was nothing. The nothing pulsed and did not stop.